Yeah, welcome everybody to our BIRA event, Internationalization of Vocational Education, an event that is organized by the now newly renamed Further and Adult Education SIG, headed by Charlotte Marshall and myself. We also co-organized today's event with the great help of Gavin from the BIRA office, and of course, together with our excellent speakers, Johannes Klassen, Ellen Vanderhoven, Isabel Huning, who is unfortunately sick today, and we have to skip her presentation, and Naomi Alphonsus. Yeah, welcome everybody, welcome colleagues to today's event. I'm very happy that so many registered and so many attended or are attending right now. Just want to say a couple of words on the event itself and on the topic of the event. So, to my knowledge, it's one of the first times that in our SIG we're discussing the concept of internationalization. I think it has two aspects really that are both in a way relevant for all our colleagues in the UK and beyond. So on the one concept, of course, on the one side, of course, the concept of internationalization is speaking to the UK model of vocational education is being exported around the world. The concept of work-based training, work-based competencies, competency-based training, and so on and so forth, is in a way very successfully transferred around the world from a UK base. So there is a need to discuss how this concept is exported, how it's transferred, and so on and so forth. But equally important, I think, it's to and particularly for all our colleagues who have more national, regional studies, case studies, research questions. It is also very important to consider internationalization as something that is happening to the UK or to the vocational education and training system in the UK. Even in very regional studies, we can see more and more that international concepts play a role, and that the UK is both an exporter of concepts in Tibet and also an importer of those concepts. And this happens through a variety of different ways. It could be like active transfer. Recently, maybe in the Scottish case, there was some idea of borrowing from Germany and from Switzerland. But there's also the concept of diffusion, where it's not very clear where it's coming from, but still there are policies changing within the UK, and this is worth discussing, despite the focus of our research. Today, however, we will focus on both aspects of internationalization. The first half of the event, particularly the presentations of Johannes Klassen and Ellen Vanderhoven, will focus on the idea of a global apprenticeship or global Tibet policies that could be or able to be diffused in a lot of different countries or contexts, where the UK could be one of them. And in the second half, now represented by Naomi Alphonsus, we will discuss a particular case of Tibet policies being imported to a context, not the UK context, but the context of South Africa. So with these with this framing, maybe I would like to introduce our first presenter and the first presentation: international organizations as knowledge producers in vocational education. that is presented by Johannes Klassen, a colleague from the Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg, Germany. And Johannes is since a long time focusing on the work of international organizations in Tibet, but also beyond. And I'm very happy that you participate today, Johannes, and looking forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Johannes, for the invitation, and thank you so much for being here. Yeah, in my presentation, I would like to focus on the different roles of international organizations in vocational education and training, in VET, TVET. And I would especially like to focus on their on two different aspects of them. On the one hand, as you can see from the title, on expertise, something that international organizations proclaim about themselves, they're being experts in that, but also on the political side, and especially on the politics of expertise. And you can see here in the screenshot some international organizations working on VET and TVET. This is taken from the interagency group on TVET, where multiple international organizations work together and share their experiences. So a brief outline. I would first consider what makes IOs particular in general, but especially in VET. I will then present two ways of thinking about IOs, two very large perspectives, images on how we can frame IOs in general. And then I will talk about my previously published research, where I have analyzed how IOs have been researched so far in VET, and I've made out three roles and how they appear in this field. And I will focus on each role under the perspective of how this tension between expertise on the one hand and politics on the other hand plays out. And I will also consider some current work in progress and share some preliminary results from that. Yeah, so international organizations in vocational education and training. So what do I mean with international organizations? I think it's maybe really basic, but still important to say that we are here focusing on organizations that have been created and funded by states through an international contract. And all of these organizations have a permanent organizational bureaucracy that makes them in some way also independent from their member states. So we have experts working here that may have very different ideas about what that should be than the most powerful member states. IOs, like the UNESCO, OECD, the World Bank, and the International Labour Organization, have actually a pretty long history of engagement in VET. For the ILO, it has been a topic since the organization started in 1919. It's mentioned in the preamble of the organization. And all the other big major IOs in VET have been active in this area since the post-war period. The OECD, which we know from the PISA studies, has actually started working on vocational training pretty soon after it was implemented, back then with the predecessor organization, the OEEC. Interestingly, vocational training preceded education efforts more generally. So the OEEC already began to work on vocational training before the organization would later turn to education questions. And it also changed how it would frame and talk about this topic. For the UNESCO and the World Bank, we can see from the 1950s and 1960s respectively a trend in working on VET. The first World Bank credit actually in education more generally was focused on vocational schools as one important aspect. And if you consider the history since then, we see that VET has quite strongly fluctuated in importance in many of these IOs. For the World Bank, for example, you can see that a really high importance in the 1960s, then it kind of dropped down in favor of more higher education and basic literacy skills, etc. And then it became relevant again since the 2000s. So we have still, I would say, a not well-researched history of how that has actually developed within these organizations. And I think this is also something which we could keep in mind for further research. And of course, currently, the Sustainable Development Goals make that highly relevant, especially for international organizations, where there have been several targets relating to that. And IOs also focus very much currently on work in this area. So what makes IOs special? Quite general. Well, they're the main organizations where state come together, and this is one of their crucial dimensions. They're arenas in which state representatives exchange and negotiate. This is really fundamental dimension of IOs. Almost every IO has a pretty strong arena function, but they are also actors with their own authority. As I mentioned, through their independent bureaucracy, they actually have a sort of autonomous actor dimension, which may also sometimes not totally represent what the interests of the member states are. And here, this is one dimension which, if we talk about IOs doing something in education and that which we consider usually most strongly. But then there can also be instruments of powerful states, particularly from within the organization, but also they can be drawn upon by other actors. If we consider, for example, domestic policy debates in parliaments, etc., we often see IOs being referenced and mentioned as important evidence or important voices. And quite often, when we really consider one IO in particular, we see that many of these dimensions really coexist in tension, and it's always quite helpful to consider, all of these dimensions together and how they also interact with each other. So I would like to introduce two perspectives on IOs that may appear quite simple, but I think it's kind of useful if we consider how IOs have been researched so far in that, because both of these perspectives have been represented in the current research. So quite generally, all IOs mobilize and use expertise to address international problems and also issue areas such as that. This is what makes them really special as organizations. Their use of expertise, specialized knowledge in certain fields. That's also the reason why they have been created in the first place, to really add an international perspective, which wouldn't be possible through states coming together on their own. And here we have two very different perspectives. On the one hand, we can see IOs in this way as neutral experts, a voice which abstains from the messy side of politics and which strives for international and mutual solutions. And this is usually the way that IOs often think about themselves. They're not taking sides. They're not engaged really in politics, but rather they present their particular expertise in certain issue areas. We can see this as a manifestation of what has been described as a technocratic internationalism. Here, a quote from a book which describes it as the idea that international relations should be managed by experts, bureaucrats, and lawyers, rather than by politicians or diplomats. So this is really something that IOs have been traditionally seen as, and how they would like to see themselves. But of course, as social scientists, we always see them as political actors as well. And this is a perspective which kind of questions the whole idea of there being a neutral expertise. Instead, we have here political science and education scholarship, which emphasizes more the political dimension of expertise within IOs, the politics of expertise, how IOs are as arenas also arenas for struggle between different positions, but also how they reflect and reproduce, larger positions, ideological positions, etc. And as I've mentioned, here the idea that expertise can be neutral is kind of problematized, and we also see here research that emphasizes the possible depoliticization by IOs, as one very nice book has analyzed here why international organizations hate politics. So here, quite often, IOs don't want to be as political, but rather emphasize the expert role. But of course, they always have this politics dimension in them. So I would say that considering both of these dimensions, we can say that there are, of course, some sort of tension between expertise and politics. On the one hand, the idea that maybe IOs can really contribute important knowledge for that, but on the other hand, also considering how they are acting in political ways. And this is one question that I really like to focus on in the remainder of the presentation. And I would like to draw on a previously published article I have written for JVET, where I've done an integrative literature review of academic publications which have focused so far on the roles of the most important IOs in that, on the ILO, OECD, UNESCO, and World Bank. And I've just tried to analyze how so far research has really considered what these organizations are up to in that. And from this literature review, we can see that there are three, both explicit but also implicit characterizations of IOs in that. First, they appear as knowledge producers, organizations that collect data, produce data, give definitions, also publish articles in journals, etc. This is one dimension, how they appear. The second role they have is as agenda setters, organizations with their own views about what that should be. And then, Johannes has mentioned this, also as actors that engage in policy transfer of trying to influence countries and VET systems in countries. And I would like to explore this tension between expertise and politics when considering all of these three roles, and I would also draw on some insights from current research projects. So the first role, IOs as knowledge producers in that. So when we consider IOs more generally and what they are doing in this field of knowledge production, we first see that quite often they rival or even surpass major universities in just the sheer volume of scientific output. The article by Mike Zapp, which I have mentioned here, for example, says that in the social sciences and economics, the World Bank outstrips the London School of Economics and Political Science by more than 4,000 articles. And also UNESCO is pretty active, having published pretty much the same number of articles as the IOE in London. So IOs really try to engage and be kind of, competitors to us researchers in this field, and quite often the boundary between researchers and IO staff is also pretty pretty porous. Yeah, so there's lots of people going from research to IOs, for example. What do IOs do in this field? So the first, collect and compare vet data that has been collected by national institutions. So they draw this together, they kind of synthesize this data. This is one important activity they do, but they also produce their own data on vet. And this particularly is a crucial source of organizational legitimacy for many of these organizations, because they can show that they can produce neutral expert data on different aspects of that. And my literature research, I could also see that this IO data is pretty much regularly referenced by vet researchers. We as vet researchers use this data quite often. It's an important part of our evidence base, but I think we rarely think about what kind of data is actually produced here. What kind of data can we select from the multiple sources that IOs consult here? So applying the two perspectives I've just mentioned of IOs as neutral experts and IOs as political actors, I think from the expert perspective, we have here the idea that IO knowledge on vet in one way or another adequately represents what is important in vet, what counts. So the idea that this knowledge which is produced here is neutral, evidence-based, not opinion-based, etc. But if you consider IOs more as a political actors, then a variety of other questions emerge. We can ask what kind of knowledge and data is produced here, what topics are selected, what is left out, etc. And from this perspective, I would like to highlight just one example, and that is OECD data on vet students. So the OECD, of course, is maybe one of the most important knowledge generating IOs there are, especially in vet. And if you consider what kind of data they produce on vet students, we can see two main themes. The first is that we have lots of participation metrics which are collected. So enrollment rates in vocational programs, completion rates, gender distribution, basically anything which says something about different vet systems and what the input is, what the output is, sort of. And then we also have data on labor market integration, so employment rates, for example, but also skills, professional skills, so how vet students perform in particular occupational fields, and also employability skills, which currently the current PISA Vocational Education and Training Program, PISA VET, is especially focused on. So larger transversal skills that are seen to be important in vet more generally, not only occupation-specific skills. So these are kind of the two main themes which the OECD produces data on. But what remains missing in all of this is actually the experiential side of vet students. So the quality of programs as rated by vet students, for example. Quite often also discrimination does not really appear that much in that data. So we have lots of data focusing on the labor market, on participation, but not so much how really vet students experience their particular situations. And I think this is something that we should be aware of when we reference IOs, when we reference IO data. We only get a certain glimpse into some selection of data, not necessarily everything there is on that topic. So the second dimension, which I've analyzed in my paper, is IOs as agenda setters in VET, or maybe put differently, the kinds of views that IOs have on vocational education and training. And of course, these views are very different depending from organization to organization, especially when we consider them from a historical perspective. In the current work that I'm doing, I'm drawing on these leitmotifs of education by Niemann and Martens, who have proposed that we can focus on 4 important dimensions of how IOs frame education. And they have done this for education more generally, but I think we can also use them quite nicely when we focus on VET. So we have here in the left column, maybe the classic economic framing we are used to, that education should be a means to boost individual productivity on the individual level, but also education as a means to boost national productivity. These are, of course, themes we encounter quite often when we analyze IOs more generally. But then there's also a different side, a more liberal citizenship perspective, where education is also seen as a means of personal self-development. Of course, something that we as education researchers probably would emphasize particularly, but also education as a means of being able to participate politically and socially. So currently I'm taking these leitmotifs and try to consider and analyze how they have appeared in the work of IOs since the post-war period. I analyze here historical policy reports, meeting documents, etc. And I just want to give you a glimpse in some of the current findings. So this is not a finished project, it's still work in progress. But I think I can say something about the similarities across these very different IOs, which I've mentioned. So maybe unsurprisingly for VET, because it's so closely tied to the labor market, all IOs have a persistent economic framing of VET as one key leitmotif. This is really something that appears quite steadily since the post-war period. Of course, in different variations. Self-employment, for example, is here something which has tended to appear, especially in the last few decades, as a crucial dimension. Second, the dimension which probably counts for us education researchers the most, education as a means of self-development, is really comparably marginal in those documents. Very few statements which focus on this dimension. Self-development appears, but usually it's through the lens of economic status. So gaining an economic status that allows oneself to self-develop, to fulfill wishes, etc. So not so much the classic idea, which we also have in the German literature on Bildung, a normative component, but rather more an economic component. And third, if you consider the social right and duty perspective, that as a means of social participation is, of course, something which in many VET systems is a key component of VET, or a key idea behind VET, because of the history of national VET systems. And it also appears in the documents of IOs, but again, framed through largely economic means. So the idea that VET gives the economic resources, the labor market integration, to be able to also participate socially and politically. So we can also then ask, okay, so this is what IOs think about that and how they value that, or what the ideas behind that are for them. But we can also think about them as actors of policy transfer in that. And policy transfer is usually something that until a few years ago has been largely considered only on the bilateral level. So we have lots of studies focusing on the German dual system being exported to other countries, being transferred to other countries. But now we have more and more research on how IOs do this too. And the crucial difference here is that IOs do not have VAT systems of their own, which they transfer, but they select and assimilate multiple VAT models. And sometimes the decision for what VAT model should be transferred can also change. We can see this, for example, in the European Union, where there has been a shift from first a more liberal model in the Copenhagen process since 2002 to a more collectivist model where schools and companies are both targeted as VAT providers. But we also have here some hybrid tendencies. For example, this article by Cord, which I mentioned here, makes the claim that initial vocational education in Europe is largely seen through a collectivist model perspective currently, but continuing vocational education is largely seen as modularized with some micro-credentials as well. So we have here some sort of hybrid model. It's really not that easy to pinpoint it down to one particular VAT model. But because IOs select and assimilate different ideas, they can also shift sometimes. I think this is one finding we can keep in mind, especially if you consider the historic development of VAT in IOs. So some other findings from literature from the paper I've mentioned. For all the major IOs, for the ILO, UNESCO, World Bank, OECD, we find some sort of influence on the national VAT system. So I think this is to a certain extent documented across all of these IOs, with the most studies so far being on the World Bank, however, which kind of makes sense because the World Bank is especially active, particularly in the Global South. We have, I think, comparably less studies on the other IOs, which would be kind of interesting if we want to take more, undertake more single case studies or comparative case studies. But the I influence is certainly there. However, the influence is not really a one-way street. There are some nice articles which show that uptake is often mediated by local political conditions and constellations. We see this in Colombia, for example, where governments have also kind of resisted World Bank VAT recommendations. We also see this when we consider different right-leaning and left-leaning governments, what kind of VAT recommendations they prefer. So this is something we should consider when we think about IOs as actors of VAT policy transfer. And again, if we consider the activities in this area through this perspective of IOs as neutral experts or IOs as political actors, we again have some tensions here. And even just from the IO perspective itself of considering them as neutral experts, we have here tension between, on the one hand, IO recommendations because they are because they should be neutral, because they should be internationally universally applicable. We can ask, is that really the case? Are they universally applicable, or shouldn't they be more adaptable to local contexts, even if you consider just this neutral expert framing? So I think there's a tension here, which I think also IOs grapple with quite often. So on the one hand, they want to give recommendations which are universal, And on the other hand, they also always are faced with different local contexts for expertise to be really useful, different recommendations should be given. But we can also consider how they, as political actors, actually make on what vet systems to transfer. Like, how do they decide what kind of vet model is important? And here we would focus more on the organizational culture of these IOs, also on the internal debates happening within them. But again, also considering more this arena dimension of the member state preferences and how they are voiced within IOs. This is something that is still very little researched. For example, does Germany or the UK promote its own vet system of vocational programs within IOs? This is something that we know very little about. So in conclusion, I think we're currently in a phase where research on IOs is still in a kind of formation phase, where we have a growing literature, but where we don't have yet any sort of camps, theoretical camps, or really, strong results. I mean, for some areas we have this, but for others, I think we can still do a lot of research, especially on the knowledge production side, but also more on the historical aspects. And I think what we can also see is that both of these images of IOs as neutral experts and political actors appear in the current research. We have lots of literature which just cites IOs as neutral experts, doesn't really question what they are doing politically in vet. And we have other research that tries to really get into the different perspectives that IOs have in this regard. And I think as long as that research, just treats IOs as neutral experts, it just reinforces their organizational legitimacy without really taking them seriously as a research object of its own. And for this to really do, I think we need more single and comparative case studies, also more historic analysis to kind of get away from the presentism we sometimes have in our research. We just focus on what's happening currently. I think we should especially pay attention to what's happening inside of those IOs, trying to de-black box these organizations. So that's it from my side. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so very much, Johannes. We would have 5 minutes for a short, very brief discussion afterwards, but keep in mind that at the very end of the event, we still have half an hour to discuss all of the presentations as a whole. So anyone? Yeah, Naomi.
Since no one wants to go, Johannes, I'm very, very disappointed to hear that we don't all want to be like Germany. You've sort of indicated that there are multiple models that IOs will want to implement. I haven't seen any models that aren't necessarily popular in the US, the UK, or like Europe in general. So mostly German, Swiss. So I just wonder, in your researching this, where are these models drawing from? If there are multiple, where are they actually drawing from? Because it feels like they're drawing from a northern specific pool. Anyway, so I'm just curious to hear what you think.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, of course, considering that many of IO staff members are also from the typical vet countries like Germany, Switzerland, Austria. There is a certain tendency to think about that in those northern terms. I think we can see this. And here, especially, we have, of course, distinctions between, on the one hand, a school-based VAT system, but also more liberal model, and of course the more German-speaking dual system. So what I'm currently doing, and I think what would be interesting actually in this kind of area, is to really consider the kind of the projects. For example, undertaken by the World Bank on what kind of model they have been transferring, taking this very basic distinction, of course, between the school-based system on the one hand, a liberal model, market-based model on the other hand, and then a dual system sort of in between. I think this could be a very, very interesting factor. But of course, you're right. I mean, there's of course a certain narrow perspective here in this regard. And approaching that mainly through these very typical, famous VAT models. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Great. Paul, very quick question, and then Johannes also a very quick answer. Then we'll move to the next.
Thank you. So yes, a question about this idea of neutral experts. You introduced that as a nice idea. You sort of questioned the neutrality aspect. I wonder whether you had any reflections on the expert aspect, the ways in which international organizations can be or can't be considered experts.
I mean, I think this is really the main selling point. This idea that, I mean, that was the reason why they were founded, the idea that we need to have international rule by experts to some degree. So trying to get away from politics towards having more of a specialized knowledge production, which could decide certain problems. So I don't really want to make the argument that IOs are not experts in certain areas. I mean, they often produce important work, and of course give us some data we can work with. But of course, expertise is always contextualized by the organizational culture, for example. I mean, I think when we go into the ILO or the World Bank, we have different sorts of what expertise counts. In the World Bank, it's still mainly economic frameworks. In the ILO, it's more law-oriented, more law-focused. So I think expertise is always kind of like contextualized, conditioned by what's happening within these organizations. And so I think we really consider expert cultures in this sense. So yeah, I wouldn't maybe I wouldn't as strongly problematize expertise as much as neutrality, but I think we still need to be very need to consider how this expertise is produced and how it counts.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paul, for the questions. Thanks, Johannes, for your presentation and the answers. As said earlier, we still have 20 minutes for our extended final discussion and synthesis at the end of the event. But now I would like to move on to our second presenter and our second presentation, the Global Apprenticeship Agenda, International Organizations and Policy Coordination, by Ellen Vanderhoven from the University of Glasgow. Ellen is a youth researcher with a focus on vocational education. Also, Ellen's dissertation was on the transfer of vocational education and the, in a way, negative impact for youth in Mexico. And Ellen continues to research that agenda. And today she will present her newest insights. Very happy that you're here, Ellen, and looking forward to hear from you.
Thanks very much, Johannes. And thanks also to other Johannes for setting the scene really excellently to kind of move the discussion on to become a little bit more specific, but still very much in the world of international organizations. So the title you see here is slightly different from the one advertised, and that's partly because as the world goes, there was a project in mind that hasn't got off the ground yet. But in essence, this presentation is interested in what international organizations say about apprenticeships and how that stacks up against some of the empirical evidence we have about what they actually deliver in reality. So from there comes this idea of rhetoric versus reality.
You're muted, Ellen.
Sorry. Apologies, that was in changing slides.
Start again from that slide. That's fine.
Yeah, no problem. So first of all, just a little overview of where we're headed today. First of all, I'll be talking about which IOs, which international organizations, and this concept that I've used of the global apprenticeship agenda as the background for the rest of the presentation today. Then I'll be zeroing in on 3 key claims that IOs tend to make about apprenticeships and the outcomes that they can produce. And then moving on to thinking about what's missing from those claims, what is not said when those claims are made, and what some of our existing empirical evidence about apprenticeships point to that's not always acknowledged. And so we can finish by considering that rhetoric and reality together in conjunction. Sorry. So international organizations and the global apprenticeship agenda. This stems from a paper that I published a few years ago now. It's now cited as 2026, but that's only because it took 3 years to go from publication online to publication in the physical journal. But this paper, Unpacking the Global Apprenticeship Agenda, looks at 40 different documents produced by 5 international organizations on the topic of apprenticeships. So familiar faces in terms of the logos from Johannes's presentation. The 5 organizations that I selected to focus on are the same as the 4 that Johannes focused on, who have a very important role in vet policy internationally: the ILO, the OECD, UNESCO, and the World Bank. But I also added in the European Union, which, while not operating at a global level, has a very strong interest in apprenticeships as a form of vet policy, and has substantial influence beyond simply the member states, both in terms of setting agendas for new entrants and influencing the kind of collaborative space between international organizations more generally. So those 40 documents from the 5 organizations span from 2006 to 2020 when the review was conducted. And essentially looking at those documents that these organizations produced themselves about apprenticeships begs the question, why apprenticeships? Why have apprenticeships become of interest to a global audience of organizations, but also national governments and education systems? And what are they for? Why has that become of particular interest, and what are they hoping to achieve? So as a brief overview of the findings that you can find in that paper, but if you're interested, you can go and find that paper and look in a lot more detail about the individual organizations. There are a number of aspects which are shared across all 5 of the organizations in terms of how they think and talk about apprenticeships and how they present them as a policy option. So first of all, they are all to some extent promoting apprenticeships as a viable, relevant, and important policy for transfer around the globe. They do this to a different degree, and UNESCO and the World Bank are kind of less emphatic in their promotional efforts, if you like, than the other three, but nonetheless, their work in this area definitely continues. And again, you can read the paper for more detail on that. There's also evidence between those documents of extensive interinstitutional collaboration on the question of apprenticeships, so summits and joint publications, joint kind of investigations and data collection efforts to understand apprenticeships better and to support their promotion in new contexts around the world. They share a fairly kind of economized view of education. So in the context of, just as Johannes talked about in his presentation, in the context of VET, while many of these organizations would understand education in quite broad and holistic terms when we talk about general education, when it comes to VET, and in this case apprenticeships, it's all about employment. And despite this being nonetheless an educational policy, that broader space is kind of stripped away. Equally, a kind of flip side of that coin is we see an educationalization of youth unemployment. So the problem of young people being unemployed is because they have insufficient skills or the wrong skills for the employment that's out there. And if only we could educate them better, they would go get those jobs and we would solve the problem of youth unemployment. And so apprenticeships are a means to address that problem. And the promise is that apprenticeships on a kind of national scale will boost productivity, national competitiveness, and employment figures. While all of that is shared, and there is some kind of broad themes that all five touch on repeatedly whenever they talk about apprenticeships, this policy that keeps being referred to as apprenticeships is kind of subtly reframed in different ways by the five different organizations to serve the different mandates and agendas that they hold as distinct organizations. Johannes has talked about, member states and the political role that that these organizations often have to play or do play. And that is also true in the case of apprenticeships. So as a kind of update, if you like, to that review that was conducted in 2020, in more recent years, there's been what I would call something of a quality turn when talking about apprenticeships. So there's a new emphasis on features of apprenticeship policy that denote quote unquote quality. And these are primarily drawn from DACH models. And when I say DACH, I mean Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. So we've already heard about the strong influence of German-speaking European countries on VET policy in general. And in apprenticeships, the model of apprenticeships, the dual system found in these countries, is repeatedly held up as the kind of gold standard of how we might approach apprenticeships. And as this focus on quality has come in, more and more features found in those models are making it onto that list of quality criteria. So that includes occupational standards that set sort of minimum thresholds or expectations of what students within particular occupations can and must achieve during their training. A greater emphasis on social dialogue as making a good apprenticeship system. And this refers to the kind of relationships of governance between different actors, between employers, the state, but also social partners, including trade unions. Another feature of quality repeatedly referenced is the importance of training for mentors who work in the workplace or who work with apprentices in the workplace, rather than assuming that existing employees are already ready to be kind of pedagogical guides to young apprentices that might join their workplaces. And more. There's more than this, but yes, this new concept, not new concept, but this new emphasis on the concept of quality apprenticeships and never letting that word quality drop is kind of circulating more and more in recent years. So when apprenticeships are talked about, what are the three key claims that I'm going to discuss here that keep recurring about what apprenticeships can achieve, what outcomes they will deliver? This is not an exhaustive list of claims made in favor of apprenticeships. A truly kind of inexhaustible list of claims often gets made about what apprenticeships can achieve. But these recur very consistently. And importantly, these all relate to outcomes in terms of young people's experience of the vet system and of apprenticeship specifically. And that's exactly the gap that Johannes was referring to earlier in terms of IO's knowledge about vet systems, and in this case, apprenticeship systems, which, I'm going to highlight some of those gaps that we have from broader evidence coming up. But the three claims that recur are, first of all, that apprenticeships promote social inclusion for young people who are traditionally understood to be vulnerable. This is a feature of vet systems in most parts of the world, that those from lower socioeconomic strata or with other forms of marginalized background are found disproportionately in vocational education systems, and that within those vet systems, apprenticeships are a really key way to improve the social and economic outcomes of those young people and promote their inclusion in broader society. Now, as Johannes has already highlighted, that the framing of social inclusion tends to be primarily economic, that if people get a job, that's what counts as social inclusion. But there is more than that promised in a lot of the rhetoric. A second key claim is that apprenticeships, as one particular form of vocational education, help to improve the quality and relevance of vocational education more broadly. So apprenticeships are often justified on the basis that the current vet system is failing, it's not relevant to the real world of work, that it's not high quality enough, and that apprenticeships, by linking up the educational offer with the demands of employers, is going to solve that problem. And young people will be exposed to the highest standards of learning, the latest technologies, the latest occupational knowledge in the workplace. And what they learn will necessarily be highly relevant to their future careers, because that's what's going on in workplaces right now. So how could it not be? And a third claim made is that apprenticeships are particularly effective at smoothing the transition from school to work by creating this kind of hybrid environment that still has some of the protections and systemic features of a school environment, with the additional component of some kind of vocational learning, not total abandonment of theoretical development, but equally it's a real life workplace with real life colleagues and employers, and systems of hierarchy and learning and understanding that helps young people to transition into the world of work and ensure that they are ready and attractive to employers upon completion of their apprenticeship. So that's our three claims, but what might be missing from the picture of each of these? First of all, on the question of social inclusion, there is an important trade-off that's contained within the idea of an apprenticeship system, which is a trade-off between equity and selectivity. So very often apprenticeships are promoted on the basis that they will help to improve the esteem of vocational education more broadly by improving the quality and the relevance. So this will be a really high reputation track within vocational education, and that will pull up the reputation of vocational education more broadly. At the same time, serving this social inclusion agenda implies welcoming a cohort of students who may not have a stellar academic track record coming before them, that they may find themselves in the vocational education system for precisely, the complex reasons linked to their vulnerability and forms of social exclusion that they've faced or have to kind of encounter in their lives. And so creating a system that is at once high esteem and considered reliable by employers, and welcoming a population of students that has a complicated relationship with their education or their broader social kind of belonging, it sits in tension. And that trade-off between an expansive program that welcomes all but acknowledges that it might not be completely smooth sailing all the way through, and that this is a form of education that has second chances and third chances contained within it, versus a system that's highly prestigious and that employers really trust. The reality is, when apprenticeships are implemented, it's more often the selectivity side of that trade-off that is pursued rather than the equity one. And so the claims to social inclusion become undermined. That in seeking the second of our claims, the first becomes harder to achieve. And that the tendency to opt for one side of the trade-off is something that's not often acknowledged in the way that IOs talk about apprenticeships as they promote them. This is also, apprenticeships are also kind of famously understood as a highly gender segregating pathway that tends to reinforce the concentration of men and women into male and female dominated industries. And partly that's related to the role of the employer in being able to select apprentices, replicating some of the gender biases and discriminatory dynamics that exist within many of those industries and workplaces. So the promise of social inclusion is not necessarily equally distributed when we start to look at the question of gender, favoring men over women. Beyond gender, there are a variety of exclusionary and discriminatory workplace norms that spill over into apprenticeships, whether there's plenty of work on race and ethnicity as a component of young people's exclusion or poor experiences within apprenticeship programs, gender intersecting with social class. So while education is by no means a perfect environment, it operates on a different set of norms about development and the protection of young people that's not necessarily present in the workplace, which has a different set of agendas, and those exclusionary dynamics spill over into apprenticeships and impact the outcomes that young people can take away from those programs. And coming to the question, I highlighted about social class, the evidence seems to suggest that for the most precarious youth in these programs, precarious transitions continue, even within apprenticeships. And the promise of social inclusion is generally delivered for the most advantaged within a generally disadvantaged cohort. So we have this kind of widening of the gap that can potentially take place within a generally disadvantaged, generally so-called vulnerable cohort of young people that find themselves already in vocational education. Apprenticeships specifically are helping the most advantaged of that stream to find their way to greater social economic inclusion, but not all who find themselves within that educational space. Coming to the second claim of improving the quality and relevance of vocational education more broadly, when it comes to apprenticeships, it has long been acknowledged that exploitation is an integral risk of apprenticeship programs. You're placing young people into a production environment, for want of a better word, where the goals of the employer are to maximize their profits and make sure that their business runs according to their priorities, which may, if you find a long-sighted employer, may include the development of their workforce and the good treatment of their employees and their apprentices, but it may not. So just as exploitation is a feature of every workplace, it's also a feature of a potential feature of every apprenticeship system. And so there's I've described this as a firm lottery. You could get very lucky. You could be hosted by an employer that takes it very seriously and treats you very well, but you could not. And there's not always an obvious way to glean that information before starting, nor is there necessarily an obvious way to solve the problem once it occurs. Within that, there's two sides of the lottery. There's a kind of pedagogical lottery. So Fuller and Unwin have this idea of expansive to restrictive learning opportunities available to young people in their apprenticeships. 1 second. We hope that employers will be offering the expansive, but it's very often the case that young people find themselves engaged in fairly narrow or even menial tasks that center on the kind of output priorities of the employer rather than on the more holistic development that young people should be exposed to in their apprenticeship learning program. And there's also a relational lottery in terms of the relations with other people in the workplace and with those in positions of power within that workplace. So there's extensive research about instances of mistreatment, abuse, and also simply isolation for apprentices who find themselves as, the single apprentice in a workplace, by far the youngest in that environment. So that's, the softer end of the scale. But nonetheless, a complex situation to find yourself in at 16, 17 years old, that can be very demanding for young people. And it does stem all the way to far more grave instances of mistreatment and abuse. And when we look at apprenticeships as they move around the world, let's say we do have scenarios where this, you've lost the firm lottery and you've come out with a less than optimal firm, both in either pedagogical or relational terms. We find that when apprenticeships are transferred into new settings, the protections that exist in that ideal model, that quality model, most often drawn upon the DAC concept of a dual system that involves relationships with trade unions in governance structures and offering kind of employee status and social security protections for young people. That's one of the things that disappears when this policy moves around the world and is implemented in new settings. And in terms of how international organizations talk about apprenticeships, has not been something that's been consistently emphasized as key when the policy is adopted in new places. So apprenticeships expose young people to this risk, and in the form that they're being transferred most frequently, do not necessarily provide sufficient protections to support young people once this kind of incident, these incidents occur. So, I've highlighted that exploitation is a risk and that we have this lottery. Of course, some win that lottery, and there are plenty of cases of young people having really positive experiences in their apprenticeships. However, the problem even then, when we think about the impacts on the wider vet system, is that apprenticeships can involve a process of cream skimming, whereby within a broader vocational education system, the highest performing system students, deemed to be the most kind of mature or responsible or able to engage with the workplace with the least vulnerabilities, can be skimmed off into apprenticeships. And kind of Johannes mentioned at the start that my work has focused on Mexico a lot. Colleagues there discussed the idea of a blue-collar aristocracy being created through apprenticeships, that this is a fairly narrow and small program within the wider vet system, and that the best, quote-unquote, students are being funneled into it, leaving everybody else behind in the wider vet system, which rather undercuts the idea that vet as a whole is being lifted up by the presence of apprenticeships. And indeed, in that case, no additional funds were given to the vet system to run the apprenticeship subsystem within it. So in fact, resources were being diverted away from the wider vet system to support the most advantaged and most secure students into this more advantageous route. So some may lose the lottery, and those that do win it maybe the gains that they make may be drawing resources away from the wider vet system rather than truly supporting it as a whole. And then finally, the claim of smoothing transitions from school to work. So again, it's a kind of acknowledged feature of apprenticeships that they are quite sensitive to crisis, economic crisis, given that they require firms who are willing to host young people and then firms who are willing to hire young people when they complete their training. There is kind of some emerging evidence, if you like, that in quote unquote developing countries, or rather countries that might have lower state resources and lower stability contexts when it comes to the question of crisis, that school-based VET delivers better employment outcomes for young people, despite consistent emphasis from international organizations on work-based VET and apprenticeships as the ultimate solution to smoothing transitions. And of course, if we think about apprenticeships, they have limited influence on the demand side of the equation. They don't intervene in the quality or the quantity of employment on offer to young people, which can be as much a part of the problem as this concept of young people as insufficiently or inadequately skilled for the world of work. And beyond those kind of structural considerations, one thing coming out of my own research has been the fact that young people are not really spoken to or consulted or worked with in the process of thinking about new apprenticeship systems. And they live in a context that's fairly universal these days of, that meritocracy is very much real, and that if they work harder and pursue all of the opportunities put in front of them, they can and will kind of reach the better life that they're looking for. And so young people are not making the choices within apprenticeship systems that is assumed that they will be making by policymakers. A big one being that where apprenticeships allow them to, they continue to attend higher education after they finish their apprenticeships. And that is not the desired outcome of policymakers who are adopting apprenticeship programs, nor the perceived or hoped for outcome of international organizations promoting this policy. The hope is that young people will exit education at this intermediate skill stage and enter the labor market at that point. But as long as nobody talks to young people who have been told over and over again that higher education is the route to a better life and that they should do everything they can to pursue that route where they can, they likely will, which interrupts this idealized journey from school to work via an apprenticeship. So reconciling that rhetoric that is promoted by international organizations with the reality that comes from some of our empirical knowledge. That quality turn that I referred to, this increasing emphasis on the structural considerations that ensure that young people are treated well in the workplace, that they are exposed to good quality pedagogical experiences. I see that quality turn as an attempt to integrate some of the critiques that have been made against quote unquote poor quality apprenticeship systems that deliver some of the negative outcomes that I've discussed. However, that quality turn only increases reliance on quite a context-specific model, this German-speaking European model. It's still drawing the idea of a quality apprenticeship from that model, yet promoting universal mobility of this policy to a great variety of contexts that have very different institutional structures. And the greater the demands for quality become, the greater the demands on the adopting context become to create a whole bunch of new structures, which that concerns me that it risks further deficit framing of apprenticeship adopters, that further pushes this idea that this is the right way to do it, the quality way, and you can't do it, and that's why negative outcomes are delivered, rather than questioning some of the underlying dynamics of apprenticeships in any context, as highlighted by a variety of research. So I think that a lot of the empirical evidence we have about apprenticeships and how they function internationally really punctures this rhetoric that apprenticeships can solve all the problems, and that they are this one little educational intervention is a panacea for all the kind of social, economic, and educational ills that states are understandably desperate to address. But holding apprenticeships up as the solution, I don't think is appropriate. And I also think that there's need for skepticism in terms of further interrogating the actors and the systems and the dynamics that sit behind the global transfer of apprenticeships. There is a whole political economy to the idea of apprenticeships as a valuable solution, as a valuable piece of policy knowledge. Doesn't mean apprenticeships can never do good, but a whole variety of actors are gaining prestige, influence, and cold hard cash out of positioning themselves as experts and valuable collaborators on the topic of apprenticeships. And, I don't mean to be kind of wholly cynical. It's important that policy work and policy collaboration takes place. But I do think that an overly rosy picture in terms of the promise of what apprenticeships can deliver has accumulated. And I think there needs to be greater interrogation of the pros and cons of apprenticeship, so that people involved in that process can consider whether it's the right solution for their context, what might be lost, what might be gained in the process of adoption, and with what results. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much, Ellen, for this fantastic presentation, bringing backstage to front stage, you could argue. Yeah, we would have time for one quick question and one quick answer. Otherwise, I would have a question. And my question would be, Ellen, why you think that the German model, German, Austrian, Swiss, you call it DACH model, is used for transfer, despite that this is one of the models, or maybe one of the few models that has a philosophical underpinning, and which has this, deep root into social partners, including in the governance of the system and so on and so forth, where there are other models that maybe do not have these attachments. So why this this discrepancy, if you like?
My view would be because there is a rather simplified perception, if you like, that the presence of the presence of a strong apprenticeship system in those countries has delivered really kind of commendable and enviable economic outcomes for those nations, and that if you are to take inspiration from that system, you could see some of those impacts replicated in your own country. I don't necessarily think the same can be said about some of the other apprenticeship models that are on offer globally. If you think about the French or the British more liberal model of apprenticeship, I don't necessarily buy into the argument about the kind of economic miracle of the German-speaking apprenticeship system has delivered. But that narrative is there. And I don't think that narrative is there for apprenticeship systems, the other models that are available. There is sometimes a conversation that goes on of kind of, okay, that one, the German one would be nice to have, but let's be practical. Maybe we can only have the British, so we'll make do with that. And of course, in this space, when international organizations talk about apprenticeships, it's a very sort of amorphous concept of there are a variety of different apprenticeship models available, different approaches, but they all get talked about under this same banner. But consistently, the line always comes back to, during the global financial crisis, the German-speaking European countries weathered that storm thanks to their apprenticeship systems. Therefore, everybody should think about having apprenticeship systems, even if you don't actually end up with the German model. That legitimating line is still consistently present in the way that IOs talk about them.
Great. Thanks, Ellen, for again for the presentation and for the brief discussion. We will have a break now until past. Please keep in mind that there is a slight change of our agenda because, as introduced earlier, Isabel Huning can't be with us today. So Let me just tell you that after the break, Charlotte Marshall will take over my role as a moderator of this event. So let's have a break and be back at past. Thanks so much.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've been able to have a little bit of a comfort break, preferably take a step away from your screen, even if it's only for 6 and 7 minutes. It's really important. Oh, 6-7 minutes. It's really important for us to be able to do that. But I'm also really excited to begin our next presentation on the institutional expertise and international partnerships in vocational colleges with the wondrous Naomi Alphonsus. Can I just check, Naomi, how are you doing with bells in your background? Are the bells?
They actually have just stopped. So we're just going to pray church bells are not going to start.
Because colleagues on the call, things are never quite so simple, are they? So it's an absolute privilege to be able to welcome Naomi Alphonsus today to be exploring her research and how that TVET researcher is translating, so how the skills translate into work, thinking about unpacking qualifications, expertise, and what it takes to build meaningful occupational knowledge. So Naomi, the floor is yours, bells and all.
Okay. Charlotte, can you just tell me that they can see, you guys can see my slides? Is that okay?
I can indeed. That's perfect.
Okay, great. I think when you have many words in a title, it's evidence of the fact that you're like struggling with something. So you have a long explanatory title. This is actually a paper that I've been writing for years now, and I keep on deciding not to finish it. It comes out of my PhD, which I did in South Africa. And I think the reason why, like, I've really struggled with this sort of part of my thesis is that when it comes to making, it's saying, okay, this is what the evidence is saying, this is what I think about IOs, this is the influence of IOs in this particular situation in South Africa. It's just, you have different levels of understanding the situation, the more things you get exposed to. After this research had occurred, I went to Germany and did some field work there, exploratory field work, and that sort of shifted my understanding of like what we would see as a German expert in South Africa and what a German expert in GIZ actually is in Germany, and and just like the way they would deal with things that I've like encountered, they would be a little bit more cynical. So, or not cynical, but they'd be a bit more cautious about some of the things that, international organization consultants would say in meetings. So I'm going to try and take you through what I initially found and sort of what I'm trying to figure out now. And sort of a way forward. So as a background, my research was looked into whether reforms for occupational qualifications and standards in South Africa. This happens in 2014, but it's mostly instituted like into the colleges in the last, like, let's say 7 years, 10 years. And these qualifications are different because they are said to be, more holistic. Their training is more holistic. And South Africa sort of implements this after, this is the second big reform in the democratic era. So just as so occupational qualifications and this sort of model is promoted in South Africa by the GIZ, but the ILO and the OECD the ILO was heavily involved. The OECD has a very similar model that they use called occupational profiles. And so it's not, and the British Council was also involved in one of these sessions that I went to. So I studied whether these reforms would actually lead to better preparation of work. And that was my overall question. just taking a bit of a step back, why there's a certain type of intensity that exists in South Africa around why the system is broken, why it's not working, what do we need to do? And then also partnering onto that in South Africa, when there is a perceived solution, when somebody says, oh, this is the solution, South Africa will go completely in on the solution. And so in some ways, when an international reform happens across different countries, South Africa is often an example of like what it looks like if you completely go in on something and like embrace it. So that would be sort of the perspective that happened on what happens now. But that is because apprenticeships in South Africa just have a long, not so great history. And so the early apprenticeships in South Africa were actually linked to colonization and exploitative relationships. And they weren't this sort of mentoring, relationship between a master craftsman and a novice. I know that's a bit idealized, but they were actually forms of indentured slavery. So most apprenticeships in South Africa in like the 1850s start off as like a way to keep people on your property to work your farm. And so they will have their apprenticeship as a form of having work, and they will work a farm, but they won't be able to move around, and they're like basically locked. And if you're found not working on this farm by the police, you would be arrested. And then that sort of also then shifts into, and I'm really making like big historical jumps, but the next sort of big system that the democratic era is trying to deal with is apartheid. And apartheid had a very specific policy around the white population and raising the skills of the white population. And so apprenticeships were deeply entwined with white domination and racial segregation. And sort of the high-skilled technical jobs were secured for the white population, and then they would receive the training for that. And it was very difficult for a non-white person to enter those systems. So in the democratic era, this is 1994 onwards, the government has now inherited this really weak work-based apprenticeship system that essentially is only working for maybe 10% of the population. And in some cases, there's an oversupply of artisans, and the companies are, this particular period, the 80s and 90s, there's a recession in the 80s, and then, people are just cutting a lot of these apprenticeships, which were in apartheid era, just very good employment, very good training, very connected from the company through the state. But they were doing it for so few people that obviously when you come into the democratic era, like the problem is that there aren't that many placements for people, and the system doesn't work for everyone. Okay, before I go into that. So also the democratic era is really notable because so South Africa has the elections, and we're in 1994, and so that early period is just influenced by a whole lot of reforms, because everyone's like, we need to make the entire education system fair, we need to make it equal, so they embrace like a complete turnaround. So there's the national qualifications framework, and we have different style of apprenticeships called learnerships, and the learnerships are basically separated. So the colleges and the workplace training are separated. So the student can go and get their college training, and then they would have to go and find their workplace training. But obviously in that sort of context, what happens is that you can go to college, but you would need sort of the necessary social connections to secure your workplace training. So, and that became difficult because a lot of students would get their college training and then they wouldn't have their workplace training and they wouldn't be able to qualify. And even though this system of learnerships comes at a time where South Africa was being, there were so many different organizations in South Africa, international organizations working, funding, different ways, different interventions and policy reforms in education. This sort of emerges as a huge problem for South Africa. And then in the early 2000s, they're trying to solve this problem of learnerships and that you're sitting with a whole lot of students that haven't done workplace training and haven't graduated. And so they decide to implement occupational reforms. And in some ways, occupational qualification reforms combine the work experience and the college training. And so it's now on sort of the sectoral authorities and the college to secure the pathway. But, there are other problems that ensue. What I want to sort of focus on is a part of my data where I looked at the implementation of this, so the thinking behind it, and who was involved in the implementation of this reform. And so even though there are 3 different stages, so the first stage would be the qualification development, which used experts from, had a community of experts and practitioners that were made up of a variety of people, from employers to educators to government officials. I attended 2 of those sort of qualification forming workshops, and it was just it was several different people. And in it depended on the situation, how many people would arrive and participate, because it was voluntary. So sometimes you'd have a lot of employers who'd signed up, for example, and not anyone pitched. So that was a dynamic in those actual groups. And so this group would put together the qualification and the assessment. And it would be seen as a collective agreement, very similar to the way in which Germany models its so-called stakeholder involvement and how they create the qualification together. The second part of this was that when colleges were trying to implement the qualification, they struggled to interpret the curriculum. So a Swiss NGO comes in with a pilot, and they're like, we're going to make this dual apprenticeships. They fund it, and they create their own second intended curriculum, which is quite similar to the first intended curriculum. There's a curriculum framework in the first intervention, so the occupational qualification. And then there's a third stream of my research that looked at how that implementation was going, and I specifically looked at colleges that were successful in implementing these qualifications. And the framing of my study, initially, I created this concept called, it's a Christopher Winch concept, and I widened it. And it was on occupational capacity, and occupational capacity as a concept is about having the ability to practice. And if you think about training is developing that ability to practice in a field. And that's made up of specialized knowledge and social organization of work. And there's a paper from 2023 that I've written, if you want to go and look that up. But basically, any ability to practice in an occupation requires specialized knowledge that you need to apply in your field. So systematically organized knowledge that leads to autonomous practice. and this is what you're trained in, and it includes disciplinary knowledge and practical knowledge, but it also includes the notion of you applying that knowledge in an autonomous way and in a way that expresses professional judgment. But on the other hand, occupational capacity is shaped by the social organization of work, which means that there are characters, I suppose I say characters, I mean actors in society and groups of actors specifically that will shape and influence the nature of this specialized knowledge and how the specialized knowledge is expressed in practice and training. And with training, you've also got to think about regulation and those aspects. So the first group is professional communities. And so professional communities are seen as the gatekeepers of specialized knowledge. They're the ones who will basically take, be the people who said, this is how you train, they're experts in their field. And it'll be a combination of professional bodies typically have a combination of practitioners, of educators, and they sort of hold the standard and also will maintain the specialized knowledge and increase on it. So if there's an innovation in the industry, they're the ones who are going to push like for professional development. If there's something that's not working, they will sort of step back and say, this is not working, why is this not working? And often things like building standards, for instance, will come out of these professional body type of organizations. The second sort of group of actors are institutions. This is a very generic word that I'm using here in a very generic sense. And Abbott itself when he talked about institutions in this way, he was talking about how in modern society we've had sort of these organizations that arise that have their own agenda, whatever it might be. You might be a charity, you might be a department store. So his specific example was a department store. And the existence of this department store as an organization is now going to shape your occupational practice. So they're jobs that now exist because a department store exists. And so it's actually the organization itself and the existence of it is going to change the kind of occupations that exist within a particular time. And the last one is state. And what I really enjoyed about Guy Standing's book on occupational citizenship, where he talks about these he actually talks about professional bodies, institutions, some exist, and state, is that he talks about like how, you have the state can act, is basically acting in somebody's interest. And whose interest they're acting in will show in how they fund training, regulate training, and he places them all all of these actors as neutral in the sense that they will have particular actions that support a particular group in society. And this is why the state must be representative of the majority of people groups, kinds of people in society, and that once a state becomes too influenced by a certain group or certain group's agenda, that is problematic. But basically, the state encompasses this idea of how professions are regulated, how training is regulated, how assessment is regulated. So like a regulation function, but also, how they maintain the fairness. And one of the things that he goes into a lot is about like what is fair to the worker, what is fair to the company, what is fair from the person who's receiving the services of a company. And it's he's just got a very interesting take on it. So when you're thinking about the state, we're thinking about the state as an actor who makes decisions here. Okay, and so going into gosh, I feel like I'm running out of time. Okay, let me go into my data here. So I studied electricians and plumbers. And the specific reason why I studied them is because they are very involved in public safety issues. And for most occupations that, you know, that are in this sort of category, so this would be plumbers, welders, there's like a public safety aspect where if they are not following certain codes and standards, they will endanger the public. And so it's, you know, in South Africa, you have sort of building standards that everyone across the world is following. And that's the context in which I want to jump into this data, because one of the problems was that within these community of experts and practitioners that would meet, they were because the government was working so closely with GIZ and also this other Swiss MPO, they would bring in foreign consultants who were experts in the curriculum. Because the problem in South Africa was that everyone was like, no, the curriculum is terrible, which I'm not saying it's not, but the curriculum is out of date. We need to update everything. And so we need to start from scratch. So we're going to bring in these foreign consultants and they're going to help us fix everything. And so this community of experts would often be led by a facilitator who wasn't a subject matter expert, who wasn't an electrician, to shape the first intended curriculum, so the curriculum framework, and the more explicated, so the more extended version of it under the Swiss sort of model, the Swiss MPO. And what would happen is that the experts would be sort of answerable to these international consultants. And so this is one of so I asked them about the experiences, and one of the electrician experts expressed frustration with, wow, really, Charlotte? Okay. Expressed frustration with the foreign influence. And he basically says, you know, you can't implement this international model into our country because you need buy-in from grassroots. You have to understand where people are at, you know, where people in the colleges are at. And if you don't have buy-in from grassroots, you can have this great international model, but no one is going to implement it. Okay, so that's the first sort of thing. And then the second sort of issue, I'm really trying to think how quickly to explain it, is that in this interaction in this workshop, one of the issues was that the foreign consultants had obviously been told, you need to do this particular thing. And so one of it was that they had to have sort of a list of learning outcomes that the students must have, occupational standards, but they were essentially learning outcomes. And what they needed to do was come up with these things that students would do on the job. And one of the issues was that, you know, they wanted to, just going to skip ahead. The students were told that they needed, oh, not the students, the experts were told that they needed to create an invoice. The student needs to create an invoice for a gate motor. And one of the problems with that was that, yes, the student eventually needs to do that, but that's not a great, like, identifying those things are not a great starting point for a curriculum, because at this stage of this practical example, the students hadn't even learned how to install a gate motor. So trying to start at examples of what the students must do at the end, such as entrepreneurship in the sense that they need to create an invoice for a gate motor, which is how this is all framed. What the people that were sitting in front of the guy was saying, like, listen, but they haven't even learned how to do the gate motor. They haven't learned theory, the practice, and et cetera. Sorry to rush through that. So one of the things that the research points to is that context matters. And it's very difficult to mimic another system. And one of the hard things that's I think is difficult when people come into a different situation is that, if you think about the German consultants, their system is very different from a South African system. I mean, the way funding works, the fact that they're so well funded, students aren't paying fees, right? So, and that when they graduate, they most likely will enter that occupation because German labor markets are occupational. They are much more regulated. While in English-speaking countries, we do have less regulated markets. There's that great Lisa Wheelerhan study where they talk about how, majority of people that do particular kinds of training don't land up in the job that they eventually are working in. So what does that mean? That means that when people are thinking about bringing another model into another country, thinking about the things that make your system work, such as funding in the German system, such as the availability of jobs, is much, it's what makes the perception of the system like working. Is it this model that they have, or is it their supporting economy, the fact that training is very well funded, that they can afford to have inefficiencies in their system? Also, like there's often been the question in our sort of TVET cluster on why that people have raised questions on why would you as a country accept that kind of help, accept that kind of model if it's not going to work for you? And the problem is that these sort of interventions from international organizations come with lots of money. They come with lots of money for pilots. They come with lots of money to do things within the system for equipment. And all of these international organizations will easily outspend the national departments. And so that is an attractive thing to politicians and policymakers in a particular. It's good to say, oh, we have a German system, or we have the best English system, or whatever it is. But the challenge is that I don't think that in our particular situation, going back to that electrician example, there are pockets of training that are going on within South Africa that are good. They're doing it well. And instead of trying to go and figure out why are those guys succeeding at delivering really good apprentices and really good electricians, what are they doing? What often happens is we have this idea that there must be a model that comes and is put on a country, as opposed to trying to figure out what is actually going on in the situation. What is the expertise? How does the expertise development happen? And understanding this sort of context, and that's not happening. So, and there's a very outside, we are bringing the solution onto you solution, which doesn't always work out practically. Okay, that's me, Charlotte. Sorry.
And I was just about to step in, but what a wonderful place to just pause that it doesn't always work in that particular fashion. Colleagues, if there's anyone on the call that does have a question specifically for Naomi, do feel free to either take your mic off and ask it, or again, feel free to pop it in the chat. However, Naomi, I'm going to absolutely abuse chair's privilege and jump straight in with a question, because that final thought there where you said, why is it that this happens? Why is it that people want to do it? And you've talked about the financial benefits of that. Would you argue then that by adopting those models, or rather, who is it that you think benefits the most? Is it the organisations that are then able to take that international acclaim? Do you think it's the students of where it does work well? Who benefits? What's the benefit other than the financial?
No, I just don't want to sound cynical. That's probably why I haven't written this paper. I think the people that benefit the most are the funders, in the sense that they have, they can, whenever you go on people's websites and they're proclaiming this huge success in the model that they've implemented, often there's an International Labour Organization report that says this country has implemented, South Africa has implemented it, Ireland has implemented it. These following countries has implemented it, and it's been so successful. And we are like succeeding at this. And there's so much, like, while they will give money for the funding, right, or an initial pilot, there's so much money that goes into implementing those occupational qualifications, like taxpayers' money. So it's sort of like, I was trying to explain it to Johannes, I think, Johannes Schmees the one day, and I was like, I give you my like phone, and you, like, what it takes for me, like, you give me your phone, but I have to give you like my Apple MacBook in return. And that's kind of the exchange and how this is going to really work. So I just think, like, I do think there are good people within these organizations that are really trying to help and understand. So I won't take it away from that. But I just think this idea that an external model is going to come in and fix everything without people really spending time on the ground, without really understanding the context, I think anyone can see that that's actually quite flawed. Yeah, let me leave it at that.
Thank you so much. I suppose this is perhaps opening it up a little bit further to Ellen as well, because there seems to be that similar thread between both of your presentations. And Garvin, if you want to put spotlight on all presenters, I don't know if the screen's changed for other people or as it has for myself, but thinking about that almost lack of consultation. So in Naomi, in your example, not speaking to those people that are working in those contexts and work in those specific environments. And Ellen, in your presentation, you spoke about the fact that students aren't necessarily actually spoken to, and their perspectives are not actually part of this wider narrative. So I wondered if there's anything else you wanted to say to that, thinking around how do we challenge those narratives, and how do we get those people from South Africa, those electricians, those plumbers that have this valuable contribution, how do we access that voice from the student as well to add to this narrative? Challenging question, I know, and I'll leave it to you to decide who responds first.
I don't mind saying something first, Naomi. Yeah, I mean, I should preface by saying that there are very few policy-making structures that are very good at talking to the quote-unquote beneficiaries of that policy. So this is not unique to VET, it's not unique to international organizations, it's not unique to apprenticeships, because it's really hard, because policies, especially the ones we're talking about here, tend to be intervening with a population that is already marginalized within broader social structures, is already in a particular education system that is not as kind of institutionally rigid. For example, I'm kind of talking to colleagues at the moment who are working on the ICCS, the International Civic and Citizenship Education Study, kind of a big, large-scale assessment that's now expanding to an older age, and they want VET students to participate in that study. And they're struggling with the fact that how do you get VET students to participate in a highly standardized large-scale assessment when they're not necessarily in schools, or they're in and out of schools, and how do you capture these people? So that's one simple example of how complicated it could be to access the populations and gather their perspectives. So I'm not, it's an easy critique to make, and it's a complex thing to solve. But I do think, academia is not flawless either, and not to blow its own trumpet too much, but there is some really kind of interesting, complex work that goes on in partnership with civil society as well, that actually is more embedded and knowledgeable about the specific communities impacted by various policies, that could be spoken to, that could be linked in, or at least their findings actually reviewed and taken into account, rather than the kind of circular policy conversation. So that there are some people who are very receptive to that, and there are spaces within the work of these kinds of organizations and even the publications they produce where it kind of shines through. But when you come to very official positions and very kind of practical technocratic action and nice neat recommendations that have to be created, I think that complexity falls away. So I'd love to see more engagement between those different realms of society that have different forms of knowledge, and for nothing to be kind of taken seriously as a quality solution unless some component of conversation with the people who will actually be impacted has fed into that. That's my view.
Thank you so much. Naomi, did you want to add anything?
I don't know if other Johannes did. Johannes K. Sorry, we're not going to call you the other Johannes the whole time. Do you have anything to add before me? Because I spoke quite a bit.
If you want, you can go. I could just make one point that I cannot really answer this particular question, but I mean, international organizations also now quite regularly use the local context as a buzzword also. So they have this problem on their agenda, but the way they approach it may be judged quite differently from how they would see it. So I think, yeah, it's kind of interesting to see that this local expertise, also context sensitivity, it is on the agendas of IOs, but I think there's, yeah, we can still have lots of criticism.
Yeah, I think like it's such a I know, like now that I've sort of spoken to lots of people and interviewed lots of people, I've realized, like when I was in Germany, I spoke to somebody and I realized that they are briefed. The guys that come in to South Africa are briefed in a particular way, so they are told a particular story about the context that they're going into and what's required of them. And there is this general sort of, they don't know what they're doing. They need you to come and help. You know what I mean? So I I'm not going to say that every person that steps into a contest in South Africa does a particular thing. Also, they've been briefed in a particular way. There are always these perceptions that it's done better in Germany. In South Africa, you just told a lot. It's done better in Germany. It's done better in the UK. But now, having gone to those countries, I mean, and when I was visiting colleges in Germany, there were some really badly funded colleges. Like, where I was like, oh, shame, you're actually not getting to do this. It was actually the employer Bildung, and like the employer funded school, and this other school that had a significant EU grant that were doing really well at delivering on and graduating students. So the like inner city school wasn't doing so well. And so I just think that, like, it would be great if people were also reflective of the generic model that they're trying to promote. Like when a country comes in, like when you come in maybe as British Council and you say, we are using this system. And if you spend enough time in Britain, you're like, okay, they're not using that system. Or you go to Germany and you're like, okay, there are parts of their own system that are better. And it's not this, especially in Germany, there's no like uniform German model. I would just argue that it differs from state to state. So I just feel like if people were just a lot more nuanced about these things and the struggles and what really holds their system up, what is actually really making their system successful, then, and that there are things that are difficult to replicate. I think when you're always giving one solution for everything, that is where the problem starts.
Fantastic. I've got so many thoughts, but I'm very aware that I could end up just grilling our three presenters today, and I'm more than happy to do that. But colleagues on the call, if you do have any questions that you want to bring forward, thank you so much. Is it Margarita today?
That's right. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all, to all the presenters for the really very interesting presentations. I was actually wondering whether any one of you has worked on the question of competition between the international organizations themselves, how this is dealt with, because especially if we look at the data issue that Johannes was pointing out earlier, I mean, they're producing overlapping data, and I'm wondering whether there is some kind of competition whose data is more used or not. And then also there is this fact of a kind of Anglophone vet agenda and a Germanic or whatever vet agenda, and also this is would be an interesting aspect to interrogate whether they are more in competition between each other or not. So these are I think are interesting points. And then I have a last short question. You've probably heard about this, I think, quite new initiative by some international organizations and the German government called Towards a Global TVET Agenda. And I'm wondering, this question goes, I guess, more to Johannes, whether this would be an example of a national government using IOs to drive their own political agenda in the vet sector, or whether I understand this wrongly. Thank you.
3 questions there. Colleagues, who would like to take a stab at the competition first and foremost with the data and the way that that is engaging in this field?
Yeah, maybe I can go ahead, although I'm not sure if I can answer really that question, because it is an interesting question. I think it's also a question which is she can pose also for IOs in general, and not only in vet. Do we have a division of labor, or do we have competition here? I think at least in vet, and with what Alan also presented, there are many initiatives where at least the inter-organizational collaboration takes place, like the interagency group on TVET, which I've mentioned. So, I mean, there are, as you have said, cases where the EU and the OECD in particular kind of produce similar data on needs, for example, students not in education, employment and training. We have very similar data. So I would say that there's a tendency for collaboration, but of course, for every organization, having this kind of data is a source of legitimacy, of organizational legitimacy. So no organization would want to lose that. But I think there's definitely, especially right now, conversation, more of a convergence happening than maybe in the previous decades, which we have seen. So maybe now competition will kind of, maybe now it's more of an attempt at dividing the labor here in this regard, but still every IO wants to have this particular position in the field and to be relevant.
Just to jump in, I am not a data person, so that is not where I would kind of have a lot to kind of comment on. But precisely the question, I guess, of kind of ideational competition is something I'm very interested in relation to apprenticeships. That's the piece of research that I hope to do and had not done in time to be able to talk about today. Because in fact, kind of building on what we said before about wishing that policy design involved some of the perspective of people who will be impacted by that policy. The flip side from a kind of academics perspective, talking about international organizations, is to not only understand them based on the nice shiny front that's presented through particular organizational documents and declarations and all that sort of stuff. So I think insider studies play an important role in understanding some of those tensions and jostling and forms of competition that go on. And I think one thing I would really like to explore is the kind of context of ideational collaboration and competition that's gone on as apprenticeships have come to the fore, and whose arguments are winning out and why, and in what spaces or with what actors when we move to a kind of national level. So I don't have the answer today, but I think it's very worthy of further investigation. I think it's really interesting.
Gosh, yeah, okay. So I'm not necessarily a data person, but I will say that when it comes to any sort of IO's data on South Africa, I don't trust it. I would rather just go to, we have like our own internal stats essay, Stats South Africa, and they're very, very good. So I typically will not look at because the IOs sort of get their data through the education department in our sense, and the education department systems actually aren't that great. So and stats essay is just generally really good. And if the tax revenue service releases anything, I will always look at that. Their data is absolutely excellent. And in every single country in Africa, when I do research, I actually look at their statistics departments first. Before, like, I just don't trust international organization data when it comes to that kind of thing. So there are other ways of looking at the data that I would pursue first. The second part of that question is the competition. I think there's a lot of competition because everyone is vying for money. I think there's a lot of money changing hands. Initially, our NQF system was very heavily influenced by the UK, and there was a lot of British counsel. By the time I was coming into research, which was 2014, 2015, it was like, there were just so many German consultants, like even in the train going to Pretoria from Johannesburg, which is like the center of policy. So, even though it looks like now I've come into the group with German consultants, I'm kidding, Johannes squared. But it's just, I would say there's a lot of competition because there's a lot of money changing hands, and and everyone wants to be seen as the one who's made the success in a low to middle income country. So, but that's just an observation. Like, I have no concrete evidence.
Thank you so much, presenters. Really grateful for that. We have someone else ready with a question. Bill, would you like to share your question?
Thank you, Charlotte. Less a question than some kind of observations, if that's okay. So, the three, but I hope they won't be too long. But there are quite a few things, interesting things been raised in the discussion. And Margarita raised this question of, do the international organizations compete on the basis of their data? I certainly think that the data that they produce, the rafts of experts that they have, the banks of data that are made publicly available are part of their competitive armory. I can't remember the term the business management people use for this, but they're one of the resources that they use in their mutual competition. Although how genuine, to what extent these organizations are really in competition with each other, and to what extent they have a division of labor, is something I think we could usefully debate. Some of them are represent VET as a technology and a means to an end, and some of them do try to represent it in a more humanistic way. Let me come back to that. I do want to say that we've looked at several kind of intermediate aspects of vocational education around the world. We've looked at the agencies. We've looked at the development agencies and the international organizations. Of course, at the top, at the highest level, what's vet all about? It is in many ways the way that the competition between nations has been waged, I would argue, for hundreds of years. You might find that some of the earliest examples of systematic vocational training are to be found in the naval dockyards and in the munitions of colonialism. Now, of course, we conduct those wars to some extent through a struggle for soft power, although, as we see this year in particular, sometimes we put that on the shelf for a while. And that's always entangled with those global conflicts. And you can look at it at so many different levels. At the bottom of it, as Ellen reminded us, we have the student, the apprentice, and in your expression, the mistreatment, abuse, and isolation that they can experience, and which I guess can create permanent damage for some people. Other people regard it as rite of passage, which they then go on to revisit on future generations of young workers. But the kind of big picture of all this, I just want to come back to this, is vets represented so often as a means to an end, as a technology. And without wishing to wax lyrical and Heideggerian about all this, it isn't just a technology. It's also a set of practices. It's also things that happen in real people's lives. And our role in all this is to dissect, I think, the ways that those activities, which are portrayed as a legitimate means of bringing about a future economy or a future kind of social world, actually play out in the lives and the misfortunes and difficulties of the people who are entangled in those systems. Sorry, that's very long for a question, Charlotte.
No, it's an interesting one, and to be honest, I've kind of had similar questions, but I've split them off in my mind into two. But the one that you've picked up there, and Ellen, if I can come back to something you said in your presentation that I think Bill's just alluded to as well, is almost that, as you described, the firm lottery, that almost the students might win the firm lottery, or they might drastically fail in the firm lottery. And one of the things I made a note of is almost how we capture some of that or protect some of the students that are facing that, because as Bill's just said, oftentimes employers, if they're not necessarily in that higher echelon of firm lottery winners, can just see it as a rite of passage. Well, I had to go through it, therefore you should have to go through it. And it's almost a perpetuation of some of those inequalities. So I wondered if perhaps you could speak to that, which is one thought that I sort of shared with when Bill was just sharing there. And there's that other one as well in terms of those, the means to an end. And my other question, although I'm stealing Bill's a little bit, is that if vocational education or apprenticeships especially are set up as this standard that's going to fix the world's arms, all of these things that are going wrong, are we not creating a situation where we're setting TVET up for failure as well? So there's a real danger when we have this narrative as vet's going to solve all of the problems. Well, actually, then what happens when vet doesn't necessarily deliver? It might deliver on some, but not all. So I appreciate that. Like I said, sorry, Bill, I've stolen the limelight, I've stolen your thinking a little bit, but in those two sort of questions, that the firm lottery, Ellen, perhaps to speak a little bit of how we protect and remove some of those ideas of, well, it's just a rite of passage, I had to do it, you've got to do it, so on and so forth. And then more broadly, if we do have this standard that vet is going to save the world, how do we celebrate the successes that it does achieve without then, lamenting it didn't solve everything? And I realise that's pointed perhaps a little bit at Ellen, but colleagues, do feel free to chip in.
No, that's okay. I'll start with the kind of firm lottery, how to protect. I mean, first of all, I'm not going to claim that I've done the robust and rigorous research that I should do to be able to say, well, this is the solution. And I probably, I would shy away from giving a solution that applies everywhere, because that's exactly what I'm critiquing. But I think, so, my work particularly focuses on adopting apprenticeships in new places, apprenticeships that, not just researching ones that are well established, but ones that are kind of taking inspiration from international models, whichever model it may be, and building something up from the ground up. So that implies a number of things. First of all, often employers have not been well engaged in the vet system previously. And that's exactly why apprenticeships are sought, because they're seen as this reform to move vet more towards an employer perspective. And that also means, therefore, that I have seen more panic about the participation of employers than panic about the participation of young people. That doesn't mean that attractiveness to young people is not a major concern. That is, one of the major kind of menu agenda items when thinking about vet reform, including apprenticeships. But still, if we don't have employers, then we definitely can't have young people. Whereas if we have young people and no employers, then it doesn't matter. It's not going to work. And in the kind of pressure, as there inevitably is in a kind of policy setting, to scale systems fairly quickly, what I've witnessed in Mexico, for example, is, well, there's an agenda set that we need this many more places for young people by next year. We need this many more employers involved. So there's absolutely no incentive in the system for the actors who might hold those employers to account for their poor behavior to really kind of reprimand them, or, have the stick held up of, you could be kicked out of this system. It's a kind of constant game of temptation to bring employers in, no matter the consequences for young people. And it's not that people in the system don't care about young people. These are educational actors in local colleges or whatever the kind of relevant local structure is. They do massively care about young people, but they believe that the way to help those young people is to get them placements with employers. And that could be jeopardized by too much complaining or too much stringency in terms of expectations and standards. So, but I think fundamentally what has to be challenged is the idea that apprenticeships are good because they are apprenticeships. And that even if the environment has all of these negative consequences, that's kind of worth it, because it's still an apprenticeship, it's still good exposure, and it's part of this bigger system that's definitely doing good. So I think for me, you can't forget employers. They're really important. If you are going to have apprenticeships, you have to have a positive relationship with them. But I do think that there's a need for a rebalancing of actually all of these actors' interests matter in terms of delivering the outcomes that we claim makes this policy worth pursuing in the first place. And that by constantly leaning towards that actor perspective, we degrade the quality, even in terms of the highly instrumental goals that are apparently being sought. So that's question one. And the setting that up for failure, I'll let colleagues speak to if they have anything to say.
With the limited amount of time as well. So Johannes and Naomi, you have 1 minute each. What do you think that provocation of the means to an end, as sort of Bill mentioned earlier, and the dangers that perhaps induces for vet and the future of vet?
Let me just quickly go. The one thing I think about vet and its future and how it can work is, I really think people need to stop throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Like, if there's stuff that's working in a place, in a country, striving for like some other model that is supposedly better is not always a good thing. And models might work in certain places and not work in other places. And so I wish people would sort of not try to break what's already fixed in certain situations, what's already working, and maybe acknowledge that and build on that and work on making that better instead of like starting from scratch again. So that's the one thing I would sort of put up there.
Thank you so much. Johannes K.
Yeah, it is a very interesting provocation. Although I would say that at least there we have a definite convergence around these organizations that don't want that to fail in that sense. So I think we can see nowadays more and more efforts in this direction. Also, what Margrethe Langthaler mentioned with towards the global VET agenda, where Germany is also participating in. I think there's a lot of collaboration going on with the aim of transforming VET. And I think we're also currently in a moment of crisis for VET generally, like digitization, AI will change the world of VET quite severely. And I think this is where IOs especially think they have an entry point or something to say about that, because they are the forward-thinking experts, the future-oriented organizations, which can have the luxury of thinking about how the world will look like in 30 years. I think this is also something particular about IOs, which maybe governments don't do so often. This visionary attempt at thinking. So, yeah, but it may be the case. I don't know. I think we'll have to stay critical in that evaluation. Yeah.
Fantastic. And I think what a wonderful way, the privilege of looking forward, but remembering to stay critical feels like just the most excellent way to sum up our conversations today. So thank you so much for all of your contributions. And for colleagues on the call, I would just invite you to say a thanks through that in an emoji in the chat or however you can to our presenters, but certainly from Johannes and myself as SIG conveners, we would really like to thank you for your presentations today. Very, very thought-provoking and very, very timely. So thank you so much to each of you. Just as we exit this space, we are due to close at 16:30, so I have abused that just a little bit by 2 minutes, but just to signpost to a few things that are happening and that you might want to get involved in as part of the SIG. So the Further and Adult Education SIG, as we are now known, feels like a massive achievement. The SIG Meet and Discuss is taking place soon, and Garvin's going to put the details for that in the chat. If you wanted to sign up and register for that, it would be lovely to carry on the conversation. The conference that's taking place in September, we are also having a SIG meet and greet on the Wednesday of the conference. So again, if you're at the conference and you're able to join us, it would be lovely to see you there as well. But again, just as we exit this space, just a massive thank you again for your attendance in these conversations. It's really useful to keep these going, and it only happens from the support with Bera. So a special thank you to Bera for hosting this as a platform today. But you are now released into the rest of your, and I was going to say Wednesday, but it's not Wednesday, into the rest of your Thursday. So colleagues, thank you so much. We'll be around for the next couple of minutes, but you are invited to finish with us just now.
Thanks so much, everyone who joined.